jobs, innovation, investment at this point in time?
The answer is yes, and I'm glad profit popped up again if it did, because some quarters that might be a dirty word, but hopefully among a lot of us here we understand that it's not, and that drives. It's one factor that drives innovation. I agree with Richard. There could others as well, but sure, wireless is it's a very good example of when you have a regime that was deregulatory, or if you prefer, you could call it light touch regulation or whatever. And in the case of wireless, of course, you essentially took the states out of it, because of the spectrum issue. Since then, it's just difficult. There are some people that take this position, but I think it's really difficult to argue that we just haven't had, number one, that we don't have a competitive marketplace. It's none of these network industries, as someone said, are ever going to be like the wheat market, but I think the wireless market's competitive, and the result of that competition, has been just continuous innovation. I mean, I can't keep up with it like my children can, but it's continuous innovation, really. So it's a good example. I just want to say, and this maybe will have to be more in the nature of a footnote to the discussion, but since I do believe in markets, Larry was talking about the regime we have for managing the spectrum, and now it's difficult to go back and get there, although the secondary market proceeding, I had understood when the commission went through this 2 or 3 year process, and there was task force and rules and everything. Maybe I didn't understand it sufficiently, but I thought that would lead really to the ability to actually create more of a market in spectrum than apparently it has. But Larry, you could imagine a regime. I mean, I believe that had we not embarked upon the current spectrum regime with the FCC controlling, or the government controlling the spectrum, as opposed to really establishing a system of property rights in the spectrum, that actually we would be much better off. We had to endure these decades and decades of this command and control type of spectrum allocation. And I understand the people that have spectrum quite naturally want to keep it and protect it, and Congressman Boucher alluded to that. But the more we can introduce, I guess the real point is, the more we can now introduce more flexibility into the use of the spectrum, so that you can have a market-oriented type of regime. The more we can do that, the better off we'll be. And then finally, just to maybe perhaps be a bit contrarian, or perhaps to show how much I don't know, when you were talking about how we are now, wireless is clearly the future now, and that's where the internet is, and I know that's what everyone says, and I'm a fan of wireless, don't get me wrong here, but when I think back over my career in communications law and policy, and when I started, I remember when domestic satellites were coming along, and that was going to change everything, and they did change a lot of things. And DSL, God, I remember for a couple of years, ISDN, the commission spent 2 years studying whether it ought to promulgate ISDN and different things. All I was saying when you were thinking about that, Larry, was, you're probably right, because you're much smarter than I am on these things. Richard probably good, but I don't really know. Maybe 20 years from now, lasers might be the way that we all communicate.
Well, we won't be going back to ISDN.
That's for sure. I agree with you on that.
Mr. Bennett, what are your thoughts?
Well, I had
On
this
this
little
topic.
pet peeve about the word wireless. You remember when we used to call cars horseless carriages?
That's right.
Wireless internet, to me, it's kind of in that. Yeah, it's got that flavor to it.
All right, so what's the right phrase?
Mobile is
Yep.
the right word, right? Mobile broadband, the mobile
Yep.
internet. Yeah,
Okay,
it's
so-
the future, and we've discovered actually through mobile broadband the ultimate value of wireline internet services, which is backhaul. That's what we should call that. So it's a world of mobile broadband and backhaul. And the more ubiquitous the backhaul is, the more ubiquitous the high bandwidth mobile network is, the more immersive it is, the more omnipresent it is. And it's certainly the place where where most of the innovation is taking place nowadays with things like augmented reality, where you carry your smart handset around and it gives you clues about the place you're in. And it's an awful lot of what the internet has done really since privatization has been mapping itself. I mean, this is what Google does, is it maps the internet. But just sort of the Google for mobile is the thing that maps the world. So it's now what we want to do is map and index and classify and organize the world itself. And so the experience that, some of the things that are going to seem really archaic fairly soon are like notions of things like cyberspace and going online. Because there's not a distinction anymore between your online experience, your virtual friends, and in real life, right? It's all part of real life now. It's not, you don't go online and you communicate with people just as you do in real life. And so there's a kind of seamlessness, and that's when the technology becomes so pervasive that it's like the ocean is to the fish. We're not aware of it. That's when the real transformative effects of the innovation are really taking root and actually changing the way society is organized, changing the way that we live, changing the way that we relate to other people. And it's not just a question of apps and information and downloads and amusing ourselves watching cats on treadmills. I have to throw that in because I think cats on treadmills is just so cool, and nobody could have anticipated that, I think, in prior times. So yeah, it's and I think this is one area that we'd have to agree that the FCC got right in the net neutrality order was the largely hands-off attitude about mobile internet. And the large, to the large part, they exempted that certainly from the anti-discrimination rule.
But this is an example, and I do agree, they largely did, but the real test will come in the implementation of it.
Well,
but I agree with you, except I pointed out that one of the first complaints that someone's making a big deal about, one of the groups, we can name it, Free Press, that agitated for this for years, they're talking about a violation of net neutrality and something a wireless carrier has done. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
How dare Metro PCS sell people a cost-effective service that lets them do 90% of what they want for half the price?
But it's net neutrality.
Yeah, I understand. And it's really, it indicts a lot of the things that people that were, fairly reasonable about says, yeah, we really shouldn't allow arbitrary blocking of services in these kind of sweetheart deals where it's only YouTube and nobody else. We shouldn't allow it. But they did it, and you kind of look at the overall package in relation to the other things they offered. Seems like
We'll see.
It's the training wheels, it's kind of the entry-level package. That's kind of reasonable. Now, my concern about it, though, is that, and I wrote a blog post about the FCC's order that said, has the FCC created a stone too heavy for it to lift? And people who are familiar with medieval theology will appreciate that reference. And it's probably about, 4 people in this room?
I got it.
Yeah?
I thought it was a burrito too hot to eat.
Yeah, I actually was a philosophy major before I got into technology. So, now, when you get whatever the rules are, and whether they come from Congress, whether they come from FCC, whatever the framework is, whether discrimination is presumptively legitimate or not, I think one of the most interesting parts of the overall process is the adjudication. So somebody makes a complaint, some person that has some technical clue, as well as an economic clue and a legal clue,
He's looking at both of us when he says that.
But he started with technical, see.
Has to evaluate whether, the system that is being complained about has benefits that outweigh, whatever the harms are. And so it's a question of weighing these things. And as one former FCC chief technologist has said on many occasions, the number of people at the FCC who can even spell IP is about 3.
Well, actually, you lead us into two more questions. And how are we okay on time, Tom? Okay, great. So, question for you guys. Generally, what do you view as the appropriate evidentiary standard that policymakers should apply when they're trying to make the decision as to whether they should intervene or not? Randy, I think you might have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, and it follows up on what Richard said, because number one, I've taken the position for quite a while that because I just think it's inevitable in part. Part of in a think tank, you have to also crank in the realities of politics to some extent of the process, although it's in a different way.
No, we're above
in a different way. But so my position has been, going back 4 or 5 years, that broadband, inevitably there's going to be some regulation in some form of the broadband internet, even though, you might make an argument that there shouldn't be any until there's some proven market failure or whatever. But, and 4 or 5 years ago, I drafted a piece of legislation to that effect. And here's the key, but my position is that we're in a much, we could talk about it for the next 2 hours, but to cut to the chase, we're in a much different place than we were in the analog world, the digital world. It's much more competitive. Now, we can, some people say it's more or less competitive, but I think we have, competition or emerging competition in the broadband world. Certainly wireless is part of that, but I'm talking about the whole the broadband providers. And so we're in a different place. And so the regulatory frame that I would have, and the FCC could have done this, I've suggested, I really think Congress should do it. I think at some point it will. But you establish essentially a rule which ties the regulation to a showing of an antitrust type like showing that looks at marketplace competition and consumer harm, which is what you do generally in antitrust jurisprudence, and in order to show a violation. Now here's the point, and for a long time I've been in favor of having an adjudicatory system, case by case adjudications to someone files a complaint and you look at the complaint under that standard. So I'm in favor, and the commission adopted sort of a case by case approach, and I don't have a problem with that really, but the problem is it explicitly rejected a marketplace competition type of rule and consumer harm. So this is, in answer to your question, that's the type of evidentiary showing that I think we should have had, and I guess a hope would be, if I tried to look at it at the glass half full, it would be that, in these adjudications that take place, even though the commission didn't do it per se in the rule, that as it adjudicates individual complaints, that it begins to look at really in the way that I'm suggesting, in an antitrust-like way. It looks at, with competition in that particular market that's the subject of the complaint, how many providers, what's the market share, blah, blah, all those things, showing of consumer harm, and perhaps, to look at it in a positive sense, it can do that as it goes along.
Larry, Richard, what do you think? Who bears the burden of proof here, the regulator who wants to regulate, or the subject of said regulation as to why it shouldn't be regulated?
Well,
go ahead. Let me jump in. It depends on how the regulation is written, obviously. Could be either way. But on the adjudication process, let me pitch the Broadband Internet Technical Advisory Group, BTAG, and especially the role of its technical working group in evaluating complaints. So obviously there is this sort of marketplace issue and the antitrust concerns, but as most economists will tell you, that all comes down to how you define the market. You define the market narrowly enough, then all markets are uncompetitive. You define it broadly enough, all markets are competitive. And the FCC's economists have this concept of termination monopolies, where regardless of how many rivals there are for your broadband services at home, because you buy from one typically wireline service provider and only one at a time.